Lakeland PBS presents Common Ground, brought to you by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund and the citizens of Minnesota. Production funding of Common Ground is made possible in part by First National Bank Bemidji, continuing their second century of service to the community. Member FDIC.
Welcome to Common Ground. I'm producer-director Scott Knudsen. On this episode, cross the waters of Big Sandy Lake to Raspberry Island Folk School.
Nicer now, isn't it?
Yes, sure is. It's so nice I was able to get my camera out.
Let's do my thing. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm Gary Hill, and we're on Raspberry Island, which is in the middle of Big Sandy Lake, just north of McGregor, Minnesota.
Perfect way for landing. Last time you were here, it was the total wrong direction.
Well, Raspberry Island is one of many islands on Big Sandy Lake. There's about 18 or so islands, I guess, and most have one cabin on them. We have a year-round residence here. We live here year-round, and one other island, there's a year-round resident, but otherwise, for the most part, we're the only ones living here on the island.
Oh, we're just so happy to have you back here again. It's a really nice group.
I'm Janet Hill, and we're on Raspberry Island in the middle of Big Sandy Lake. Well, you gotta meet us at our landing at our dock, which is about a quarter mile away. We pick you up with the pontoon boat and bring you out to our house, and from there we show you where your classes are. Lots of creativity goes on here because of Gary, really. He's a wonderful teacher of pottery. He took classes down at Northern Clay Center in Minneapolis for many years, and now teaches. And of course, because he's a formal dental professor, he's a very good teacher. He loves teaching, and it's in his blood.
Yeah, somebody brought a big case of bottle.
Yeah, the buildings on the island, there was nothing here when I first came here in 1983. My wife at the time and I were camping on the south end of the island shortly after we bought it, and there was a terrible windstorm and rainstorm in the middle of the night. Yeah, tent blew down. We were just in a real scary situation, exposed to a lot of wind. Trees were blowing down in the campground, and I decided I've got to do something. So that winter I was hauling a log building that I had already started at home and I was going to use as a guest cabin. And I ended up dismantling it and then putting on a homemade sled, and then by hand power hauling it across and putting it up on the island that spring with my father. And that was the first building that came on the island, and that was a little building that's 12 by 16, and we used that for many, many years as our refuge from the storms that would come through. And then it sort of snowballed on me. I added a guest cabin, then a sauna, and then an addition, and then put in a tractor shed, and then I decided to make a good-sized workshop on the north end of the island, and that was all out of logs. And after spending that amount of time, I decided I'm going to make that into a home instead of a workshop. So I ended up thinking about putting in electricity with solar panels and a battery, and then we had put in some plumbing, of course, and we didn't have any septic system at that time, so we only had running water into a bucket and then throw it, and that was the extent of our sophistication. We had a sauna for bathing, and then we talked to the county and we got a new septic system with a peat filter, and that changed our lives. We had indoor plumbing and a shower and washing machine. Now we got all the comforts of home. And then we added another sauna, of course, on the north end. Then we had to have one on the south, one on the north end of the island. And then the Blacksmith Shop was next, and then the pottery studio came next, and then we've added a painting studio for Janet. So all those buildings are pretty much out of logs that I cut or built new, or I took old log buildings apart. And the old log buildings were oftentimes from Finnish homesteads or Norwegian homesteads, oftentimes dilapidated buildings that were of no real value and I got for nothing or little of nothing. And then I took them apart and marked all the logs, of course, by number, and then reassembled them on the island. So now we have something like 11 or 12 buildings out here, half of which are new logs and half of which are old log buildings that have been sort of resurrected, you might say, or salvaged.
He either makes buildings from scratch from new logs, or he goes out and gets old buildings, old pioneer buildings, takes them apart, drags them across the ice, and reassembles them. After he's marked all the logs with little tin numbers, which I've taken part in that, hammering the numbers according to his little log cabin map, and then he reassembles them here in a beautiful way. He's a very good craftsman. So it's a 7-acre island on Big Sandy Lake, which is a very historical lake, which is what we love about it. A lot of history has happened here since well before the fur trade, but the fur trade was a big era here. It used to be a highway from Lake Superior to the Mississippi River, and so there was a lot of activity on here for many years, and we find a lot of traces of that still. Like I said, a 7-acre island, deciduous trees and also conifers here.
In the last couple of years, we started a little folk school. We have been doing some blacksmithing and pottery work, and my wife does watercolor painting, and we thought we would start this little school to try to meet new people and people of like interests. And we've been teaching high school students for some time now. We teach high school students at no cost to them and try to teach them blacksmithing and pottery skills. And yeah, it sort of grew into a folk school where we have some guest teachers that come up here and teach specific classes.
We have the visiting instructors who come in for birch bark weaving and spoon carving, and we hope to add some more.
Yeah, one of our guest teachers is Jeff Harper, who taught the last 2 years has taught a Damascus class, which has been quite popular. There's a lot of knife making interest now, it seems. And we had an excellent class. Unfortunately, the weather wasn't so good, but it was early in the year, and we managed pretty well. Jeff taught us how to make some billets of Damascus, which is laminated steel of 2 different types that then create a pattern. And it's an old technique used for many, many years in developing a good blade for swords and knives and such.
So I'm Jeff Harper. This is Raspberry Island, and located in Sandy Lake, Minnesota. This is my son, Wowie Yahtzee. He's here to help me out with the interview, hold me in place, keep me grounded. His big sister and his niece are taking a class here, and we're here as their audience. To me, I think it's a gathering of hearts. Lots of good feelings, good people, good actions, folks passing on some good knowledge that's significant to us. It's not just arts and crafts. I think for a lot of us, we're trying to reconnect back with the earth and be part of it and feel those cycles and live a good life. So last May, I taught the Damascus steel class. I think mostly we were using the steel for tools, and it's also called pattern steel. And we made some rainbow and some ladder patterns. And so to get ready for this weekend's class, we prepped up a dozen of the smaller billets. Those will be the first ones that we do on Saturday morning. And then the second billets, the larger ones, we'll start those up. And they've been coated with WD-40 to keep any rust from happening. Rust would make it more difficult for the forge weld to begin. And also with that WD-40, when that goes into the fire, it'll make a little poof, and that will provide a layer of carbon in any space that's inside of there. And that carbon will help the welding action to begin. And then this stuff, the borax, it actually melts and forms a layer of glass around everything so that no oxygen gets in, and then that provides a better atmosphere for the weld.
I think Damascus, it's actually probably more accurately pattern welded steel now. In its day, probably was far superior to what was available for sword making and knife making because of the layers of steel that were probably used and incorporated some carbon in the fabrication. Today's metals that we have choices of are probably superior to any Damascus that you could buy because of all the highly controlled alloys that can introduce various properties of toughness and strength and so on. But It's commonly called Damascus, but the reality is probably pattern welded steel is a better terminology for it.
I like learning from him and being around him because I know a lot of the things that he knows are only known by a few individuals, and it just knowing and understanding comes easily for him, and he's able to pass it on to us. Last Saturday when we did some of the welding for these billets, I squished out a couple getting ready for the class so that we'd have some pieces ahead. And one of these squished out to this much here. And you can see on the side some of these overlap each other. So a lot of that will get cut off because any place that there's two pieces that overlap without welding, it's called a cold shut, and that will always be in there. It'll be a bad spot in whatever you make. So we'll take off those little bits of edges that overlap. You can see some of the layers on the sides. That one is one of these stacks folded up. So out of these 18 layers here, that's been folded and drawn out and then folded and stacked again. So that's 18 layers times 4. So even though that would be 72 layers, they're similar layers against each other, and then we're going to lose parts of these outsides. So you could honestly say that it's at least a 66 layer billet when it's done after we've drawn it out and made something out of it. So I think what I like best about the students is they're so willing to learn, they're so open. Some of them get a little bit of that, oh, I didn't do that right, but they get over it pretty quick. The willingness to learn and the smiles on the faces and the new experiences for them and for me. All right, guys, you need some more fuel on deck.
I don't know if that's dry.
That's okay.
For the kids who come out here, a lot of them are from McGregor, and it's a small school, and it doesn't really have an art department per se, and so there isn't much opportunity for them to do artistic endeavors. And so one of the reasons we offered this class, we had the shop class come out actually one year, including the bus driver, and all of them worked at the forge, which was kind of fun. And I became aware, based on my experience when I was in shop class way back when, we did a lot of hands-on making woodworking projects and so on. And nowadays, a lot of shop students are doing computer-aided design and manufacturing of things by computer. So they're programming lettering in and putting it on wood or putting it on glass or whatever it may be. And probably not as much hands-on skills. So I think to me what it is I think it gives students a little more confidence in being able to create something with their hands and actually physically creating something in an old traditional way, which still works today quite well, by the way, but it also gives them an appreciation for some patience because it takes time. There are many sayings in the blacksmithing world and that we apply today, like strike while the iron's hot, and you have to move right along and work while the iron's hot. You can't let it cool off too much or you're not going to get much done. So too many irons in the fire is another one. You've got to pay attention to the iron that you've got in the fire, otherwise you're going to burn it up and lose it because the fire is intense enough where it can actually melt your steel, which all of us have done, of course. Yeah, it's a good exercise, I think, in patience and in developing some confidence in your ability to create something out of nothing. And out here on the island, it saves me many trips to the hardware store because I can create something where I used to run to the hardware store and buy something, and now I can just make the part, or the hinge, or the door latch, or the door knocker, or the axe, or the chisel, or whatever it may be, can be fabricated. And a great deal of personal satisfaction when you can make something that you can actually use, and both not from a functional standpoint, but also something that's very aesthetic as well.
So it's really cool to think about. We're taking things that came from the earth. The coal came straight from the earth. The iron that was refined became steel with other things from the earth. We're adding a little bit of wood, the trees that are growing. We'll use a little bit of water on top of the fire to help it off gas. And we're adding those elements together to make one thing. Originally, I was born in Chicago. Both my folks are from Cass Lake, Minnesota, on the Leech Lake Reservation. And we moved back there when I was just a little bit older than this guy, when I was 8 years old, and I continued on with my schooling there. Graduated high school, been working ever since. A lot of times I worked in the woods or worked on the water, and that drove me into my current line of employment. I've been employed by the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe for 25 years now as a water resources person. And I get to work specifically in the lakes, rivers, swamps, wetlands, things having to do with waterways and drainage and septic systems and just kind of everything that's related to the natural surface water. So I've always wanted to learn how to do this. My mom's grandpa had a setup and he was able to fix things that they needed at their home. He had a small anvil and small tools, but he was able to do big jobs because he understood what you needed to do. I knew him when I was a young man, and as I got older and I wanted to learn to make tools, there were some things that you can do with mild steel. You can move it around and bend it and make some basic tools, but I wanted to make hardenable knives, and I just never had the opportunity. We'd poke around in a wood fire and it would do an okay job.
Jeff came out here a few years ago with his wife, Michelle, and their 2 kids, and they're just both such delightful people. They just get into everything. I mean, they're not afraid to get down and dirty and sleep in a cabin with no electricity, and they're just both great personalities and just such, I don't know, such friendly, generous people. He's been so good to teach Damascus out here on the worst possible days. We had his last class in mid-May, and it snowed that weekend, of course. But he was a happy camper. He said, this is great. So he's a pretty hardy guy.
6 years ago, my son wanted to learn about blacksmithing, and we actually found the Bemidji Metalsmiths group, Northern Minnesota Metalsmiths, and they have a monthly meeting at Lake Itasca Pioneer Farmers Village in northern Minnesota. And so we went there, and there's a lot of good teachers there. A lot of older fellows that have been doing it for 20, 30 years or longer. And so they have a lot of good words. They're all natural born teachers. And so they made things seem really simple for us. And they'd tell us something, and our ignorance, our lack of understanding, we had to learn things on our own. But some of the nice things that I like is they taught us to always have a good habit. Know where this is at, to sweep your anvil off, have it ready for your next work. And just to be prepared, think of things while the metal's in the fire heating up. There's plenty of time for visiting while the metal's heating up, but then to get to work, to strike when the iron is hot.
I was going to buy you a decent-sized hammer. You both are using big hammers.
I've got this thing now.
I started blacksmithing, I think, the first time I remember was in the late 70s. I saw a demonstration at the Gibbs Farm Museum in St. Paul. And I had already bought a forge at an auction, and I had an anvil, but I hadn't really used them. Then I went home and tried to do something with them, and of course I just burned up the metal and didn't know what I was doing. And I joined a group called the Guild of Metalsmiths shortly after that. And that's what really helped me a lot in just developing a little bit of knowledge about the blacksmithing business. And the people there were very willing to share their information and knowledge.
Should I cut off the end?
I wonder if you... You can get some flux in there. It looks like you got a delamination all along that edge. It wasn't really until I retired, so when you say how long have I been blacksmithing, if you really count the actual years, it's probably only about 20 years that I've actually really functionally, maybe 25 at the outside where I've really been doing it seriously, and then of course only in the summertime when the weather is good and you can work outside. So, got one laminate I think a little better, but still needs a little bit of help there. So yeah, I've been doing it for a while and I'm developing some skill, but it's a long process. Some say it's a lifelong process to learn, and it's something that I enjoy doing, and I'd like to share it with the young people who are interested in learning blacksmithing skills. It's something that's kind of popular now because of some of the television programs that focus on knife making and sword making and such. I think you got it, don't you? I don't see any darkness. Little tiny bit maybe in that last leaf there.
Well, he's a Renaissance man. Somebody came in this morning and looked at all these beautiful ceramic bowls. They said, "Oh, who made this? Where do you get these?" I said, "Well, those are all Gary's, you know." He loves to create things. It's a full-time job for him. He goes out after breakfast in the morning and he works all day on the island, either blacksmithing or doing pottery, or I think it's partly because he's part Finnish, or he's mostly Finnish. He says 51% Finnish. He just never procrastinates. If it has to get done, he'll do it right then. And that's why, I think that's what it takes to live on an island. You need to know how to do everything for one thing, and then also do it. You can't just say, "I'll do it tomorrow." You do it right now.
Oh, we have everybody from 14 years old on up to old guys like me, 70s, and it's been fun. And then the typical youngster is always interested in making an axe or a sword or a knife and something functional. And the reality is some of those things are way beyond their ability in the beginning. And so we try to start out with teaching some basic principles of blacksmithing, you know, drawing out and fullering and forge welding. And I think it's important to not get ahead of yourself and develop some skill first before you try to some of these more demanding projects. But yeah, we have the young and we have the old involved in it, and it's fun because I like to see the enthusiasm of the youngsters because they always take on a project they can't possibly complete. And I think the older people are a little more realistic on what they can accomplish, but still it's nice to see that they don't get discouraged by it when they take on a project that's beyond their ability. They still come back the next day and try again. So it's encouraging to see that.
Sure. All right. Cool, even handled it.
It's a neck knife.
Yep. All right, she's too. Are the scales just glued on?
Yeah.
Cool.
Well, I hardened it and I didn't drill through it. I don't have a drill press in my house. So it's just easier to do it that way.
As long as the glue sticks.
It does.
Yep, and it does. So for me, coming to Raspberry Island, I really loved the hills, Gary and Janet, the hosts here. I really like their teachers, the wide array of classes that they offer, the informal gatherings that we have amongst students and teachers and our hosts, and just the good quality of teachers that are offered here. It's been so eye-opening for me to meet such a world-class level of teachers, people that I guess I didn't believe I had access to. And all of a sudden, here they are right here, and they just teach us, and they just show us everything. And if we don't understand, they teach us and they show us, and then we walk away and we understand it.
Don't fiddle with it, just 1 or 2 whacks and then go back in.
Yeah.
There are a lot of times where you can say, well, it's good enough, but I don't like to hear that when I hear a student say, well, that's good enough. That's not the bar that we want. We want to raise the bar and have it really be the way it should be done, and have it done well, and have it look aesthetic, and have it function in a good way. And I think that's an important thing. As you say, it carries on throughout life. If you raise the bar and shoot for a little higher standard in the blacksmithing, you're going to do the same thing whether you're fixing your car or whatever it may be. So, yeah, there's a lot that transfers to life lessons.
If you're interested in taking classes out here, just check us out on our website.
We put our classes out on our website, which is Raspberry Island folkschool.blogspot.com. And usually that's in February, middle of February, so for the summertime. And we start our classes usually about the middle of May, and then end, as I say, around the middle of August. Some of the classes fill up very fast, like Tom Latinay's class. Last year we had 14 people signed up in the first 2 weeks. So it all depends on what is being taught, and the timing of it too is important. Some people are not very available in the weekdays, and they like classes that are only on the weekends, and so we try to accommodate by having a little bit of both available to them. The folk school, on that blog spot, you'll see not only the classes, but all of the requirements relative to what you should bring out here. We usually provide a place for people to stay here in cabins. They're rustic cabins. They don't have running water. Some of them have electricity. But it's free for those who are coming from out of town to stay at our cabins. And then we usually have the meals catered, or we have a potluck, or we have people bring their own food, so they can keep the cost down by bringing their own food. And it makes it a little bit more flexible and easier for us too in some ways. We don't have to prepare every meal for every person there, and that works out really quite well. And if they just are willing to come and stay in rather humble surroundings on these little cabins with a sleeping bag and no electricity, it's kind of like camping, only maybe a little more glamping, a little more high-level camping, because they're not fancy, but they work, and they're quite comfortable, really.
I think his legacy he's left here, I think, is just such an important one. He always downplays it, But his life's work is here, and it's just and to walk around here, I think people really appreciate that. And all the buildings are beautiful, and the setting is beautiful, and he's just, he's built quite a beautiful place here.
Thank you for watching. Join us again next time on Common Ground.
If you have an idea for Common Ground in north central Minnesota, email us at legacy@lptv.org or call 218-333-3014. To watch Common Ground online, visit lptv.org and click Local Shows. Episodes or segments of Common Ground, call 218-333-3020. Production funding of Common Ground was made possible in part by First National Bank Bemidji, continuing their second century of service to the community. Member FDIC. Common Ground is brought to you by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, with money by the vote of the people November 4th, 2008. If you enjoy watching Common Ground online, please consider making a tax-deductible donation at lptv.org.